Tonight, how much can we believe about the enemies of the United States? In Angola 10 years ago and in Nicaragua today, we hear accounts of communist expansion. But are such stories true? Tonight, two former CIA officers tell reporter Christopher Hurd how lies invented about Angola and Nicaragua found their way into the world's press. Two experienced journalists tell him the difficulties they've had telling fact from fiction. Some people call this process disinformation, others call it lying. The CIA just call it a standard technique.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
As they, the saying that they have is that, this has been said publicly, by the way, by a U.S. government spokesman, that our intelligence from Nicaragua is so good, we can hear the toilets flush in Managua. And I've often thought that might be the source of some of this information.
Angola, a country at war. Rich in natural resources, as large as France and Spain together, a left-wing government, supported by the Cubans, fights a continual battle against a guerrilla army backed by the South Africans. 10 years ago, the Russians and their allies sent troops and guns into a continent where they had no right to be. According to the newspapers at the time, that's how the Angolan War started. Or did it? John Stockwell worked for the CIA for 12 years, rising to the rank of colonel. His last assignment was to run America's secret campaign in Angola.
We had set ourselves well above and beyond the law, beyond the Congress, beyond the Constitution. We were lying to the President, lying to the Secretary of State, lying to the Congress about what we were doing.
1974, the Portuguese Revolution. The end of centuries of dictatorship and oppression at home, and of Portuguese imperialism in Africa. But as the colonies gain independence, in the largest, Angola, three groups vied for control of one of the richest countries in Africa. Jonas Savimbi, a friend of Che Guevara, but now an anti-Marxist, led UNITA. Agostinho Neto, a Western-educated left-winger, led the MPLA. Holden Roberto led the FNLA. He had been on the payroll of the CIA for 14 years, so he was the obvious choice for the seasoned campaigners back in Washington.
The CIA had just closed down 3 long-term paramilitary operations in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They'd had over 1,000 paramilitary case officers come flocking back to Washington. They didn't have desks for everybody, much less jobs, and morale was rock bottom low. They wanted a covert action. They wanted a paramilitary encounter. Angola was convenient. There never was a study done of who's who in Angola, who would be best for Angola, who would be best for the CIA or for the United States, or what. There was no study done. Well, the rationale was that the Soviet Union was trying to take advantage of the United States' weakness right after the Vietnam War, that Angola was getting its independence and they were trying to snap it up, and that Henry Kissinger decided that we could not be weak and we wouldn't let them do it. Our own files disproved that. We moved into Angola first and the Russians were responding to us.
But before the CIA could start a war on the other side of the world in Angola, it needed the approval of the National Security Council, a key part of the American decision-making machine, where policy is made by the top men in the government and the military.
The first briefings on Angola literally went, gentlemen, this is a map of Africa. Here is Angola. And then they went on with a chart to explain there are 3 liberation movements in Angola. One of them is headed by Holden Roberto. He's the good guy. We've worked with him for years, and they use literally good guy. Then the MPLA is headed by this drunken, psychotic Marxist poet, Agostino Neto. He's the bad guy. And they used exactly so to make sure that people understood. And then, you know, like I say, you pack off and go off to and they come in for the next briefing about Micronesia or somewhere. The superficiality of what I saw fat old men dozing off in subcommittee meetings of the National Security Council in which we were making decisions that were getting people killed. And I mean exactly the way students do in their 9 o'clock class, you know, propping themselves up and getting their glasses balanced so it won't look, you know, people can't tell if they're, and their heads nodding off. And then you'd have to wake them up sort of to get their concurrence on. So I explained something to them again.
But the newspapers contain nothing about the fascinating way in which policy was made. Instead, they fell victim to Stockwell's worldwide campaign of disinformation.
The basic theme was to make it look like a Russian and Cuban aggression in Angola. And so any kind of story that you could write and get into the media anywhere that pushed that line, you did. 1/3 of my staff in this task force was covert action, was propagandists whose professional career jobs was making up stories and finding ways to get them into the press.
From the CIA's headquarters, Stockwell put his propagandists into London, Lisbon, Lusaka and Kinshasa. From the safety of such cities, none of which are actually in Angola, they wrote press releases for the FNLA and UNITA, which were fed into the ticker tapes of the Western media. The propagandists assiduously courted Western journalists, briefing them and wining and dining them. His man in Lusaka was particularly enthusiastic.
He ran a story that the city of Mulanje had been captured by the UNITA forces, and in doing so it captured 20 Russian advisors. And they thought this would show that Russians were running the thing in Angola. There weren't Russian advisors, it wasn't a factor, and we knew that.
So I went to the British Museum's newspaper library to see how successful Stockwell had been. And here's the story in The Guardian, under the headline, UNITA captures 20 Russians. The UNITA statement, with all its convincing detail, is quoted at length. And according to this, there were 500 Russians and other mercenaries involved in the battle, and there were 2 tanks and 3 armoured cars, and even a house full of arms of Russian make. The Guardian put quotes around the headline to show they weren't quite sure of the story, and presumably that's why they put a question mark after this hopeful little piece. The Mulanje story also made it to the front page of the Times, which quotes UNITA's claim that they captured 20 Russians in the battle for Mulanje. The Times clearly believed UNITA because they helpfully tell us that Mulanje used to be under the control of the MPLA. The source for this story was the Reuters correspondent in Lusaka.
I remember reporting that very clearly, and I should stress I was not the only journalist to report it. Many of us reported it, and we pinned it on an official UNITA communique. Years later I discovered that a little CIA misinformation expert had sat in the US Embassy in Lusaka and had composed that communique, and it bore absolutely no relationship at all to truth.
When you reported it, did you think it was true?
I had absolutely no idea. I mean, you've got to remember at that stage, during a war, you're working under incredible pressure. I worked for 4 months without a day off for 16 hours a day. And all that was wanted was a flow of information. I mean, I'd done the same in the Middle East war. I was based in Damascus. And in the first week of the war in Damascus, I wiped out the Israeli Air Force 3 times over, with official statements.
Reuters is one of the world's largest news agencies. Its offices around the globe provide many papers with their only source of news from some parts of the world. Many papers actually rely on the same person for their information, the Reuters correspondent.
Well, I mean, with hindsight, some of the official statements from the side I was reporting, and I stress from the side I was reporting, but also from the side that people in Luanda with the MPLA reporting, clearly most of those statements were completely false.
Most of them were completely false.
I would think so, yes.
Doesn't that mean that for the average reader we received an absolutely impossibly distorted view of what was going on?
I think that's a very fair assessment.
But newspapers were hungry for stories, and one of Stockwell's propagandists fed them well.
So he came up with another story, which he in fact kept going for weeks, and it was a good story in terms of the CIA's propaganda interests. He had some Cuban soldiers raping some young Angolan girls. Then there was a battle, and he had that Cuban unit cut off and captured. And then he had the Cuban women, the victims, identifying their rapists. And then there was a trial, and they were convicted. And then he had them executed by a firing squad of the women who had supposedly been violated, with photographs of young African women with weapons shooting down these Cubans. There had never been a rape. There had never been the military action. The Cubans had never been captured. It was all fiction.
Stockwell did extremely well with this story. Here's the Daily Express of March the 12th, 1976. "Gun girls execute Cuban rapists" is the headline. And quoting from UNITA, it says that 17 Cubans were executed, 5 of whom had been identified as the people who had raped 4 African women a few weeks before. And here's the Evening Standard, with a bit more convincing detail, saying the Cubans were shot with their own guns. And here's the Daily Telegraph, the newspaper of record, adding a bit more detail, identifying the region from which the women came and saying that they took part in the executions. The reporter was John Bullock.
I haven't the faintest idea whether it was true, and I never said it was true. I reported somebody as saying that, as telling me that story. I certainly didn't report the facts. I reported Mr. A or sources from such and such a group as saying that. I don't know whether it was true. If you don't publish it, maybe it is true. You get, I should have thought, worse criticism for not publishing it than for publishing it. Because when you publish it, you do attribute it quite clearly and firmly to the man, the person who's saying so. If you don't publish it, you're already making a judgment. You're deciding it's not true. It's not our job to decide.
Editors are not going, in most Western newspapers, are not going to be too skeptical of Cuban rapist story. It sort of fits the general Western line and what the West wants to read about Cuba and whatnot. The truth is, all of the information we were getting was that the Cubans were handling themselves brilliantly and very generously towards the Africans.
Basically, and to put it very crudely, you can publish any old crap you like, and it will get a newspaper room.
Despite the CIA's best efforts, the armies they supported never stood much of a chance once Cuban soldiers arrived in the autumn of 1975 to help the MPLA. Holden Roberto's FNLA and his CIA mercenaries were wiped out. UNITA and the South Africans beat a hasty retreat. Back in Washington, Congress didn't want another Vietnam and stopped Kissinger from spending any more money in Angola. Interestingly, some American multinationals operating in the country had always supported the MPLA. But when the corporations expressed their views to the American government, they were treated as the enemy.
When we went in, Gulf Oil was pumping the Angolan oil. We forced Gulf to stop. And the way we did this was by Henry Kissinger placing some phone calls and saying that he would open an investigation of international bribery by Gulf Oil Company. The fighting was effectively over in about February of '76. The Congress stopped us then and forced us to withdraw. By early March, within about 3 weeks, Gulf Oil was back with U.S. technicians in Cabinda pumping the Angolan oil, with Cuban soldiers protecting them from CIA mercenaries who were still mucking around in northern Angola. Now, years later, Western corporations are doing business great with Angola. David Rockefeller, Gulf, Boeing, Texaco is building a refinery there. De Beers, working with the diamonds. They all lobby in Washington saying they have no problem doing business with the government of Angola.
But the war still goes on, with the South Africans financing UNITA. The Americans have turned their attention elsewhere, to Nicaragua. Unlike Angola, this is a country which any journalist can visit, so America's lies can be discovered more easily. But these have still dominated the papers. First, there was the arms flow story. According to Reagan, Nicaragua supplied guns to the left-wing guerrillas in neighboring El Salvador. David MacMichael was the CIA's senior analyst on Nicaragua. They asked him to write a report on the arms flow. But when he looked at the evidence, it didn't support Reagan's claims.
The argument that we're dealing with here is, do these arms come through or from Nicaragua with the complicity of the Nicaraguan government? And the evidence does not sustain that.
Undeterred, the American government continues to insist that Nicaragua is a center of international communist terrorism. According to Reagan, it harbors members of the IRA, the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and Basque separatists. So the American government has poured money into supporting the opponents of the Nicaraguan regime.
We have an obligation to be of help where we can to freedom fighters and lovers of freedom and democracy from Afghanistan to Nicaragua.
The freedom fighters he is talking about are called the Contras.
Well, they wouldn't exist without the CIA. They wouldn't. They simply would not exist as a viable force. The Contras never even received money themselves to buy arms. That was all handled for them by the CIA, and there's no way out of saying that the Contra force is essentially and almost entirely a creation of the United States government. The Contras are agents of the United States government.
Since we have been there since the very end of 1981 until now, has been a constant escalation of the war into our area, and there's been a great deal of real terrorism going on in the area. We have mass kidnappings. We've had whole villages that have been swept down on, and they take everyone, women, children, men, animals, everything that moves. We have had rapes and kidnappings, torture, murder, about everything that one could imagine that could happen in a war. And this has been carried out by the Contra.
That is, a standard technique in attempting to destabilize and overthrow a government, is to demonstrate to the citizens of that government, to the citizens, that its government cannot provide security for them. And this is the way to break resistance. And this is what they do. This is the famous CIA manual. The Takayan, laid this out very clearly for them. It's a very, I hate to say it in this cold-blooded way, but it is a standard technique.
To help, the CIA has produced a freedom fighters manual. This shows how to make Molotov cocktails, how to throw them, and who to throw them at. It gives helpful advice on disrupting transport and communications and destroying property. Other standard techniques are aimed at people.
I'm very embarrassed by the United States support for the Contra, and I think it is illegal and immoral. They don't call Ronald Reagan Ronald, they call him Donald Reagan, which is a play on the word to donation, because everything they have is from him.
They are our brothers, these freedom fighters, and we owe them our help. They are the moral equal of our founding fathers and the brave men and women of the French resistance. We cannot turn away from them.
Well, brothers, I suppose brothers and sisters, we all are of the same God in that sense. Certainly I wouldn't classify them as freedom fighters or as the moral equivalent of our founding fathers in the United States.
In 1981, the CIA asked MacMichael for a report on the Nicaraguan press, opposition parties and church.
And my conclusion was that, you know, there was a significant space for these groups to operate, but that they were in no danger of suppression or disappearance. Compared to any other Central American country, Nicaragua has by far the liveliest opposition press and media. Over 2/3, for example, of the 40-odd radio stations in the country are still privately owned and generally speak their mind.
When MacMichael spoke his mind, the CIA didn't like it. He was sacked.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states.
I certainly don't recognize any of the diatribes that have been made against the Sandinistas as to the persecution of the church, persecution of peoples, the denial of human rights. That is not in my experience.
After 4 years of fighting the Americans, the Nicaraguan government has now suspended most civil rights. In the world's newsrooms, they are more inclined to listen to the President of America than to the President of Nicaragua. So in the propaganda battle, the CIA's inventions still hit the front page. In 1982, they produced convincing evidence of Soviet bases in Nicaragua.
I used to laugh and say, look at that Soviet-style baseball diamond over there, you know. You know, this is almost foolish, really, you know, to talk about this. First of all, they're not Soviet military bases. That's the whole point. The second is that a barracks is a barracks. You know, an obstacle course is an obstacle course.
How about this for a story? Just under a year ago, the Americans discovered a Soviet freighter carrying MiG fighter planes, which they said were on their way to Nicaragua. Here's the story on the front of the Times. Moscow warned on Nicaraguan MiGs, and there's a picture of a MiG-21. According to President Reagan, this showed that Nicaragua was a threat to the United States.
And as it turned out, this was the evidence for this was based on satellite photography, which showed crates at an East European port facility, which were determined to be, in the science of cratology, the crates of the sort in which MiG aircraft frequently were shipped. And subsequent photographs a day or two later showed that these crates were no longer on the dock. And an amazing leap of logic, it was advanced that necessarily they must have been delivered to Nicaragua, or were on their way to be delivered to Nicaragua. Well, you know, it's the usual thing. The charge makes the headlines. The retraction makes the inside pages. 8 or 10 days later, it's revealed, well, MiGs weren't on the way, but that's no longer a headline. So what one is left with is the overall impression from the screaming headlines of the week earlier that Nicaragua continues to represent this enormous danger to the security of the United States. This nation of 3 million impoverished souls, half of whom are under the age of 15, you know.
Well, I would say people are very silly if they believe everything that newspapers tell them, and I think probably anybody who buys a newspaper needs a course on how to read newspapers.
Part of my reason for coming out of the CIA is that it was a tragedy, a travesty of U.S. principles of freedom and democracy, that you would have the United States setting up a tradition of supporting dictatorships, brutal ones, forming and training their brutal police and death squads, while the Soviet Union, which has had periods of pretty harsh policies towards its own people, is winding up the champion of real freedom throughout the world. If you have a dictator and you want some help getting rid of him, you cannot go to the United States, you can go to the Soviet Union.
People in the foreign policy establishment, let us put it this way, and I believe this is not only true of my own country but many others, you know, believe that in the interest of national policy that it is legitimate to lie. They do not feel it is dishonorable to lie, and when they do lie well, they expect to be rewarded for it.